Howdy, partners. It is episode 4 of the show where we stay away from LA and discuss the rest of the West. And I've got a lot of questions about the rest of the West. So I brought in the best basketball nerd that I know. And I say that as a compliment. I am talking, of course, about Kevin the Machine Pelton. KP, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a compliment and an insult with you, Tim.
Always assume it's a compliment. Always assume it's a compliment. You are coming to us from Seattle. I see a little, I think that's a little, is that a Seattle Sonics thing in the background? What do we got going on there? All right.
It is, yes,
Okay.
if I duck out of the way.
Representing there. So, like I said, I've got questions. A lot of things have gone not quite as I anticipated. And I'll be honest with you, one of those is that these Suns look like contenders. I thought it was a total circus. I thought this thing was ready for not necessarily a meltdown, but definitely a significant step back. I ask you, should the Suns be considered the team to beat in the West?
So I think the answer is yes right now, in part because of the fact that the two teams that I think we thought were all at the top of the West, and the Clippers and the Warriors, have been pretty wildly and impressive through the first couple weeks of the season. By contrast to the Suns, and you look at all the models, like if we didn't know anything about how they lost game 7 to the Dallas Mavericks, you'd be saying, hey, this team was in the finals 2 years ago. They had the best record in the league last season. They look like the best team in the West so far this season. Of course, they're the favorites. So that's the argument in favor of them. Now, the argument against, real quick, is that Utah did start 7-1 a season ago.
Right.
So the challenge for a team coming off a loss like the Suns had and like the Jazz had to the Clippers the year before, it isn't what happens when everything's going right. It's what happens when everything starts to go wrong, as you know it inevitably will over the course of the NBA season. And then do you start pointing fingers and blaming each other?
Yeah, and of course, the way that they opened the season, where everything did go wrong for them in the first half. And it's like, hey, all those demons that have been kind of haunting you all summer long, here they are. Here's Luka Doncic absolutely dominating you for the first 2 quarters of your season. You know, here's the Mavericks building this 22-point lead early in the third quarter. And obviously they came back and rallied and won that game. They've been impressive since, their only loss being in overtime to Portland. And, you know, I had concerns about the Suns, about just the black cloud lingering, the whole DeAndre Ayton situation, not talking to Monty Williams all summer long. I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad. I knew, you know, obviously the contract was, those negotiations were tense. You know, it was pretty clear that he wanted to move on. He didn't get the chance. But I don't think we've seen any signs of that early on in the season. Again, that's a TBD. And then just the fact that Jay Crowder doesn't show up to camp, you know, call it mutual, whatever you want. Boy, that's a pretty big hit to their depth that actually hasn't haunted them. Who would have imagined that Jock Landale would be one of the most significant offseason acquisitions?
Yeah, I mean, the whole talk was, okay, it's going to be Bismack Biyombo. They really loved his play last season. It's going to be Dario Saric playing center like he did 2 years ago before the ACL injury. And those guys have gotten on the court lately because DeAndre Ayton has missed time, but Biyombo in particular. But it's Landale who's anchoring that rotation. And it's 2 guys making the minimum have come up huge. I mean, in that Dallas game, it was Damian Lee. And early in the season, when Landry Shamet was out, he's still getting minutes. And then Landale, the 2 of them have Chuck Landale is definitely the best NBA player that I have ever shared a row in a Southwest flight with. That's his claim to fame.
I'm sure that's his claim to fame. By the way, don't think I didn't notice that you slipped in the Warriors as the team that we all thought would be at the top of the Western Conference. We will get to that later on. I can guarantee you that. But let's go to the one team that has beaten the Suns so far this season. That is the Portland Trail Blazers. You know, you being a Pacific Northwest guy, I know you've got your eye closely on them. I've got to ask you, do you believe in the Trailblazers?
I mean, I guess my response to that is believe in them is what?
Believe in them as a team that could be a middle of the pack playoff team in the Western Conference, as a team that could be competing for home court advantage in the first round.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's realistic. We've seen this Blazers team do that when Damian Lillard has been healthy in the past. Not always. If you go back to 2019-20, when they had, the other injuries in the front court and were out of the playoff picture going into the bubble before they ended up winning over Memphis in the original version of the play-in. But we have seen them even as recently as 2020-21 be in that kind of 3-6 mix in the Western Conference, avoid the play-in tournament. And this group that they've put together around Damian Lillard, who's really the only link to that starting lineup that exists, in Yusuf Nurkic. Those are the two links left to that starting lineup a couple seasons ago. It's a really nice combination. I think it's exactly what they envisioned coming into this season. Jeremy Grant, we haven't even seen Gary Payton II yet, but Nas Little stepping up. Justice Winslow has been really good for them off the bench. Josh Hart with his energy, particularly his rebounding, has been terrific at his size. And all of that has made the Blazers much more competitive at the defensive end than they were last season. It's a group that better fits the vision, I think, of how Chauncey Billups wanted to play. And we saw like a glimpse of that last season. There was a couple games after the trade deadline. Obviously, Dame was out at that point, but Hart and Winslow and those guys were leading them to a couple wins. And then they got a little nervous and a number of players got shut down.
Hold on. That's not the plan. That's not the plan. We're there. That was, I will say, the Blazers, that was one of the most blatant tank jobs that I've ever seen last season. I always go back to when Oklahoma City called up two of their eighth and ninth man on the G League team, played them 87 minutes that night without a single practice, and still lost. I'm sorry. I always, when it's tanking, still beat. They did not accomplish their goal. They still beat Portland. That's how bad Portland was tanking. And all that tanking, you only get the number 7 overall pick. That's disappointing. But the guy that they picked at number 7 certainly isn't. Shaedon Sharpe, what kind of upside are we looking at with this kid?
Yeah, I mean, the quote from Justice Winslow last Friday was so perfect. The sky isn't the limit because he can jump out of it. What an amazing quote. But his leaping ability is off the charts, and he's got a really unorthodox way of moving quickly and getting to the basket that I think has taken defenders, caught them off guard. He gets from the 3-point line to the rim so quickly, and that's made him an incredible finisher. He's knocked down some threes. I mean, he still does not have any idea what he's doing on the court, at the NBA level, particularly the defensive end, but he's just making enough happen right now that Chauncey Billups has kind of had no choice but to continue playing him. And in that game with Damian Lillard out, which we'll see, I think, for at least one more game, maybe more than that, starting him and playing him big minutes and him playing a key role in their win over Houston without Lillard.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the Blazers, there's two things that are really exciting. Unfortunately, Dame is out now, and hopefully he'll be back soon. But it's very clear from what we saw early in the season that Damian Lillard is still, he's still Dame. Like, he is back to being the guy who's one of the most explosive scorers in the league, one of the absolute elite point guards in the league. And then Shaedon Sharpe, he's fun to watch. I don't know how, I don't think you can count on a rookie to be consistent, but the upside there is awfully intriguing. And then, the CJ McCollum trade, it didn't work out exactly how they wanted with the way that the picks broke with the Pelicans making the playoffs. But you look at that, and man, Josh Hart's a really good NBA player. And then I know Jeremy Grant wants to be an NBA star, but you look at him as like a number 3 option, which he is in Portland, and he's a really good fit there. Those are kind of the two pieces, the two significant pieces that they ended up with that deal. The Blazers are better than I thought. I still don't believe in them as far as a top 4 type of team, but we will see. I will point out that the KP Nerdy Numbers formula had them at 36.6 wins this season.
And I didn't believe that. Like, I was higher on them coming into the season, but then they were so bad in the preseason that suddenly I started to doubt my own opinion of them. By the way, the one name we haven't mentioned in all this is Anthony Simons, who has kind of stepped into that CJ McCollum void and been that same kind of dynamic backcourt mate for Damian Lillard that McCollum was for all those years.
Yeah, and the concern there is there was obviously a ceiling on the CJ Dame partnership. Now they did get to the West Finals the one year. Didn't last very long there. It was a sweep from at the hands of the Warriors. But I will say I think this is the best defensive group that they've had around a Dame backcourt, right? They didn't have a Jeremy Grant, a Josh Hart. You know, we'll see, Justice Winslow. We'll see. He's bounced around a little bit, but there's some interest there. Speaking of CJ McCollum, is there a better big three in the West than that trio in the Big Easy? And I know Brandon Ingram's hurt, but boy, he looked really, really good to start the season. Had a heck of a year last year. Zion, you know, his butt's feeling okay again. He's back. And then CJ McCollum is a number 3 guy. Is that the best trio in the West?
So I think the question here is that the Pelicans' top 3 players? Because Jonas Valanciunas has maybe been their most consistent player this year. I mean, he's been dominant. I mean, part of the story of the Pelicans is like they've won, you know, 2 of the last 3. They did get Zion back for the most recent game, but to win a game on the road, I believe, without both Zion and Brandon Ingram, 2 of those 3 guys you mentioned, and CJ hasn't even shot the ball that well this season. I mean, he's, you know, running the show at point guard. And to me, it's more a testament to their depth and their ability to go, because Herb Jones, who was such a big part of their playoff run last season, has also been out during this time, and they just haven't missed him because Trey Murphy III has been incredible thus far this season. He looks like the next 3-and-D guy, and like they're going to have to figure out a spot for him in the starting lineup at some point here. You know, Jose Alvarado, the energy that he brings off the bench. This team, it's to me, it's less about star talent and more about the fact that 1 through 7, 1 through 8, they look incredibly strong.
You didn't answer my question, though.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I went through it. I'm not sure who the best big 3 in the West is. Is it the Warriors? I don't know.
Well, and then it's so that you talk about obviously the best players in the Western Conference. We're going to talk about Luka. We're going to talk about Steph Curry. I just feel like there's such a significant drop off. Like for the Mavericks, there's Luka, and then who's their second best player? I would argue Dorian Finney-Smith. You know, some people want to say Christian Wood. You know, like there's not a big 3. There's a superstar and a supporting cast. And I don't know that you can say that necessarily about the Warriors, but Steph is clearly the man on that team. I think Draymond's their second best player. Is Jordan Poole the third? It's not Klay Thompson now. Maybe it will be again at some point, but it's not Klay Thompson right now.
I mean, Wiggins might be in that group.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Wiggins, you know, I no longer can smirk and be snarky when I refer to him as All-Star Andrew Wiggins. He actually, I thought it was a joke last year when he made it, but he played up to that level certainly during the playoffs. And you know, frankly, the extension that he signed, it's hard to say it's a bargain when you look at the luxury tax and all those implications. But hey, man, like if he's making 26, 27 million in today's NBA, that's a pretty nice deal for the Warriors. Speaking of those Warriors, why do you hate the Warriors? Why do you, KP, the Machine, hate the Warriors? You had the defending champions as a play-in team, a dynasty, KP, a dynasty as a play-in team. Defend yourself.
Well, it's not me. It's this computer that you're recording on. It is clearly what hates the Warriors here. I mean, like I ended up being the lowest of all the statistical projections. Mine ended up the lowest, but a lot of them have the Warriors less than where conventional wisdom had them coming into this season. And I think a lot of that stems back to the fact that they had these 2 years where they, you know, obviously the first year was largely due to injuries. Mm-hmm. The second year, it wasn't quite the same group, but it was a similar group. And they were, in fact, in the play-in tournament, despite Steph Curry playing at a near MVP level that season. And when you're using projections, the best projections are going to take, multiple seasons of data. So in one of those, two of those seasons include seasons where they didn't end up making the playoffs. I think it's kind of inevitable they're not going to look as strong as you'd expect for a team that was as good as they were last season. And then they lost some important parts to that team. Gary Payton II, who we haven't seen yet in Portland. That's going to be an interesting piece for them to add. Otto Porter Jr., who also was dealing with injuries in Toronto. So weirdly, I guess they wouldn't have had either of those guys anyway. And, so much of the excitement about the Warriors was they have this group that's good enough to win the championship now.
Right.
And then you've got this developing core of young lottery picks and Jonathan Kuminga, Moses Moody, and James Wiseman. And that group hasn't held up its end of the bargain right now. I mean, I know you tweeted last week about James Wiseman's plus minus, or you mentioned it in the context of looking up, finding out Kevin Durant's plus minus.
So I knew it was bad. And so I'm like, does Wiseman have the worst plus minus in the league? And at the time when I looked it up, he was second worst behind only Kevin Durant. I actually looked it up again today. I was doing power rankings comments, and I was curious where Jalen Green rank. I knew it's second worst. Do you know who the worst plus minus is? This is just a little nerdy trivia. The worst plus minus in the league right now. I'll give you a hint. He wouldn't otherwise come up on this podcast because he's not in the West.
Someone on Detroit.
No, Rui. Rui Hachimura. Yeah. Wow. So, but Wiseman is really interesting. Like Kuminga, he has not earned minutes yet, right? Wiseman is interesting because every time I watch him, there are things that you're like, wow, like, dude, a guy who's that big, running the floor like that, he's going to have some dunks. He's going to have, he's going to block a shot. There's going to be just things that combination of size and athleticism are going to jump off the TV screen. And you're like, damn, the dude played 16 minutes and he's minus 11 on a pretty consistent basis. What do you look at with him as like reasonable hope for his development this season? Because right now, what you're looking at, I think, is you've got to play him, you've got to try to develop him, and then late in the season, entering the playoffs, as it stands, they're going to have to make a decision. Hey, do we pull the plug on him and crank it back up during training camp?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the injury that he had last spring sort of solved that particular challenge for Steve Kerr and the Warriors coaching staff. I mean, to me, the reasonable expectation has been if he can be their version of what JaVale McGee was on those championship teams, where, clearly they have reoriented the offense a little bit this season to feature him more in the pick and roll, because that's what he does best is, finish out of that. And that's not really Steve Kerr's philosophy and what he wants to do, but you got to adapt to the players that you have. And then defensively just be a presence around the rim and block shots in that way and kind of don't muck things up, because that's
don't be totally lost. Yeah, don't be totally lost when it's not just being big and athletic.
Exactly. And for him to be up there in terms of plus minus is pretty troubling, given that he's not a starter. He's not someone who's playing massive minutes this far. They're minus 22.5 per 100 possessions with him on the court, plus 16.9 with Kevon Looney on the court. And look, that's not all him. That's also some of the other young guys. But I mean, we saw a similar thing happen when he was a rookie, and it's troubling that it's the same trend that we saw that.
Right, but the just the talent is so obvious that I think they do, even at the expense of wins and losses. I think they do have to invest the time. They have to give him the minutes. They have to, put everything in that they can to try to develop him as the season goes on. Because maybe he ends up as a guy who makes drastic improvements throughout the course of the season, and he is a piece for the playoffs. But boy, there would have to be absolutely drastic improvement for that to happen. By the way, JaVale McGee, it is not off to a great start for him in his second stint with the Mavericks. Honestly, like I asked Jay Kidd the other night, how committed are you to JaVale McGee as your starting center? And I wasn't asking like, hey, are you going to start Christian Wood? Because frankly, I think Christian Wood is a bench scorer. And everybody I talk to around the league thinks he's a bench scorer. I think they've got him in the right role. I'm just wondering, like, why is JaVale McGee better than Dwight Powell? What I'm watching, like, one guy comes in and makes good things happen. One guy comes in and just kind of is there. So that's, just saying. I think that's something to keep an eye on with the Mavericks. But the question I wanted to ask you on the Mavericks front is, can Luka sustain this level of ball dominance? And by this level, he is the first player to score at least 30-plus points in the first 6 games of the season since 1986-87, Michael Jordan. Luka, who led the league in usage rate the last 2 seasons, his usage rate, again, small sample size, but it's a career high, 40.9% usage rate. I don't think it takes a great leap of logic to connect that level of ball dominance with the fact the Mavs have had 2 absolutely massive clutch meltdowns. Did you see the stat on their meltdown against the Thunder?
I did not see that.
So they were up 16 with 3:57 remaining, and they lost. They blew that lead. J. Kidd made sure to point out that he put C. Wood in there to close that during regulation, and as he says, it didn't go well on either end. I thought that was interesting. That was J. Kidd's clear goal for that post-game press conference. But teams that led by at least 16 points in the final 4 minutes of regulation over the last 25 years, and this, of course, comes from ESPN Stats and Information, where they also have some high-quality nerds, 9,975-1 before that game. 9,975-2. Anyways, can Luka sustain this level of ball dominance, KP?
So it's interesting that you looked at it in a different way than I did. I don't know if mine was the nerdier way, but I went to the time of possession that Second Spectrum tracks that's available on NBA.com. And so he's at 10.6 minutes per game handling the ball this season. Nobody they've tracked this since 2013-14. Nobody has been over 9.5. So he's a full minute.
Was that James Harden at 9.5?
It was not. Harden is tied for third with Luka last season. Like, he was already pretty ball dominant at 9.3. The 9.5, the guy who dominated this category early in his career that you wouldn't necessarily remember now, is John Wall.
Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah, and especially funny that they were teammates for a hot second in Houston. That was going to be an interesting mix. Russell Westbrook also among the all-time leaders high up there. But so the thing I thought you were going to connect it to, it definitely does connect to the fourth quarter meltdowns, was the fact that Jalen Brunson is in New York. So all of a sudden, where last year you had this 3-headed ball handler option with Luka, Jalen Brunson, Spencer Dinwiddie as they were making it to the conference finals, all of a sudden it is Luka and it is Spencer Dinwiddie and it is a whole lot of nothing else. If you sort it again by that time of possession per game and take each team's 3rd highest and each team's 4th highest, Dallas is the lowest in both of those categories. It's Christian Wood and Tim Hardaway Jr. next in line. So basically it is unprecedented in NBA history for one person to be on the ball as much as Luka Doncic has been thus far. And yeah, I think over a long season, you wonder if that is going to have some ramifications in terms of fatigue.
Yeah, and I will say this, Luka came in better shape than he has the last couple of years. Now, that's not exactly a high bar to clear, but obviously he was coming off a Eurobasket. He came in as J. Kidd referred to early in camp in Luka shape, right? He wasn't weighing 260 plus. He came in the kind of shape that he was in late last season. So that helps, but man, it's not just that he has the ball in his hands that much, but like he is working hard. It is like a lot of driving, a lot of attacking the basket, multiple moves. He's not shooting the 3 well at all right now, but he's just absolutely dominant as a driver. But it's herky jerky, crossover, behind the back, get in traffic, take a hit, finish those kind of things. And I think what you're seeing is teams are basically saying, hey, you know what, if Luka lights us up in the first quarter, if he has 14, 16 points in the first quarter, and we can live with that, because there's 2 things here. There's the hope that Luka is going to be fatigued come the fourth quarter because he's having to work so hard to generate all the offense. And then there's just, and J Kidd brought this up the other night. It is a challenge to play with a guy who's that ball dominant because you don't have a rhythm. And I remember talking to Jalen Brunson about this in the playoffs last year. And Brunson said he had to learn to play without a rhythm. And so, you're asking guys, and sometimes you'll see teams will not double Luka much at all. And then late in the game, double him, force the ball out of his hands. And then you're asking guys, hey, you haven't touched the ball a whole lot, but we need you to knock down these big shots with the game on the line. And that's a difficult predicament to put players in.
It's almost a rope-a-dope strategy in some ways, right? And this wasn't necessarily a double, but you saw that Brooklyn game late where Luka had been torching Ben Simmons a lot of that game one-on-one. But what happens late stages of that game? Simmons shuts him down on one possession, just completely stones him, and then comes up with the steal.
Yeah, and that the steal was Simmons coming over in the double. And then the last possession regulation, he drives and Simmons does a decent job there. Defense collapses. He hits Bullock wide open, Reggie Bullock wide open on the wing. He misses that shot. And that game was interesting, though, because in overtime, they were forcing the ball out of Luka's hands. He's making the right plays, and his guys made shots for him to beat the Nets. But again, that's something to keep an eye on. And you mentioned, I was actually talking to Tim Cato, who covers the Mavs for The Athletic the other night, and we're talking about how there's so much focus on, hey, the Mavericks don't have that third ball handler. They could have had Goran Dragic, and J Kidd basically said, I don't think he could play anymore. You can be on the roster and be in the Facu Campazzo role, the mini Boban role, sit at the end of the bench, play every once in a while, but you're Luka's buddy. Your primary job is to hang out with Luka and go out to dinner with him. Goran was not. He feels like he has gas left in the tank, and what we see in Chicago is, hey, he has the right to feel that way. But the question might not even be, hey, do they have that third ball handler, but who's their second ball handler? I think Spencer Dinwiddie, as the third guy, who he was always going to have another ball handler on the floor with him, whether he was playing alongside Luka or whether he was playing alongside Brunson. He really thrived in that role last year. But now there's a lot of times, early second quarter, early fourth quarter, where Dinwiddie's really the only ball handler on the floor. Hardaway is not a ball handler. Christian Wood can do some things in ISO. He's obviously not a ball handler. And sometimes with those lineups, it's been a struggle.
Yeah, and neither of those guys are really playmakers for their teammates. Christian Wood can maybe do it, reasonably well for a guy his size at combo 4 or 5, but you can't ask him to be your second best passer on the court. That's too much.
Yeah. What do you think of Wood as a sixth man? Obviously, it's something that he's not necessarily enthusiastic about. In a contract year, much less at any point in his career, he's made it clear he thinks he's an all-star caliber player. I know there's people around him who feel the same way. I haven't found anybody else in the league who believes that's the case. You think that's the right role for him?
It's been working well thus far. I mean, especially look, if Luka is going to be, commanding as much of the offense as he is, then you're basically just using Christian Wood as a spot up guy, and he can do that, but that's not really the best use of his skills. So look, you can separate his minutes from Luka's and stagger those two guys, even if he starts, but it is a little easier, especially if he's coming in fresh against those second units. And I think that's part of why he's been so dominant in terms of his per minute scoring so far this season. So I think that part of it makes sense if Jacob would, stop trashing him in his post-game press conferences.
That I got to tell you, that was a very interesting press conference because, like I said, he came in there with the goal because he said, I said, what happened in those last 4 minutes of regulation? And, tried a different closing lineup, blah, 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 blah. And there's like, you guys haven't asked the question that I expected, but I guess you got your answer. And I'll be honest with you, like, I'm watching that game. I'm not thinking, oh, hey, they went to Christian Wood and closing, because, dude, it wasn't a clutch. You were up 16. It's not like you went to him and, okay, here's a chance. Clutch. It became clutch because you guys melted down so much. I did think it was strange to basically point the finger at one player for a team-wide meltdown. And I think that's a pretty clear indication that there's stuff bubbling beneath the surface about his role. If he's not starting and he's not finishing, it's a tough pill for him to swallow, all those sort of things. But wow. And, and then J Kidd, like I've said, what question are you looking for? And he kind of mumbled a little bit. And I said, what are you looking for in the closing lineups? And that's when he made we didn't go with Timmy. We went with C. Wood, and it didn't go well on either end. And I'm like, okay. And then I asked him a follow-up about C. Wood, and he took another little jab, and I kind of raised my eyebrows. And dude, J. Kidd smirked. I'm like, okay.
And if anyone would know smirking, it's Tim.
Oh, I know a smirk. This was a high quality smirk, not the sort of thing you necessarily would expect from a coach who just oversaw a pretty rare level of NBA meltdown.
But the other thing you didn't mention that, it was so hilarious about that quote is like, okay, it's one thing if you melted down in regulation, and then it was Maxi Kleber who came in for him in overtime, who wasn't in, right?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look, but yeah, they pulled Seawood for overtime, and it's like, hey, overtime didn't go real well for you either, buddy.
No, that was not a winning formula either. It wasn't 16-1 bad, but it wasn't good.
Yeah, so again, that was just a rough loss, a strange press conference, and sort of thing that pretty clearly indicates that they've got some smoothing out to do there. And honestly, J. Kidd's whole approach with Wood has been very blunt. I feel like he's trying to break him. Like J. Kidd is trying to hey, you're not a star on this team. We don't look at you as an all-star caliber player. This is your role. You need to accept it. And we'll see. I've said before, I think the Christian Wood experience in Dallas could be anything from sixth man of the year to see you later by Christmas. And, that's still a big fat TBD. The one thing or a couple things I was sure about that hadn't happened is I was pretty certain the Jazz and the Spurs would be right down there by the Rockets at the bottom of the Western Conference. So, KP, I ask you, what's going on in Utah and San Antonio for that matter?
Yeah, the San Antonio part of it is not quite as catchy as Wendy's catchphrase. I mean, to some extent, like on some very small level, I'm not surprised because, the San Antonio, I think, had the lowest over-under win total in the league coming into the season, and Utah's was very low. And you looked at those rosters, at least as they stood at the start of the year, and you're like, there's too much talent there, proven NBA talent there for that.
Right.
Like, as you compare them to the Houston, Detroit, Orlando group that everyone's very excited about their rookies and their young talent, but that doesn't translate to wins in the same way as Utah having 9 or 10 quality NBA caliber rotation players does. And so it was always a question of, how early does Utah pivot to a full-on rebuild? And those guys are wearing other uniforms. But like
Danny Ainge has some work to do.
I mean, they've been good enough so far that I don't know, maybe you stick it out, especially a Minnesota lottery pick looks like it might be a little better than you thought coming.
Oh, you said a Minnesota lottery pick, a little Freudian slip there. You're going that far. I tell you what,
they're never going that far, but
I don't know how many more San Antonio games they have. Do they have another San Antonio game on the schedule? Because they've gotten their butts kicked by the Spurs twice talking about the Timberwolves.
Yeah, and then San Antonio, like the second game of the I think it was the 2-game home series, right? They rest Vassell, they rest a couple, Josh Richardson, I think. Like those guys missed the game, and San Antonio still somehow win. They were like probably trying to lose that one. San Antonio, like Utah, is less surprising to me because again, those trades, they didn't leave them with anybody as good as Donovan Mitchell or Rudy Gobert. That's for certain. But there's a lot of quality NBA players there, and Lauri Markkanen has been awesome so far. And you look at the Utah bench lineups have generally been quite good, which makes sense because these are guys that are like 6, 7. Oh, there's a lot of 5th, 6th, 7th guys on that roster. Right. So, it reminds me a little of the Knicks of recent vintage, where the starting lineup might not be as good as the bench because the starting lineup, like, it not look as good as the bench because they're kind of equal ability. San Antonio is much more surprising to me because even with, the Vassell, Keldon Johnson, Jakob Poeltl group, Trey Jones was their only real point guard. They started the season trying to play Josh Primo in that position after they released him after the allegations that he exposed himself to women multiple times. They've actually probably played a little better, even though they don't have another real point guard on the roster. And they're shooting the three really well. I'm old enough to remember when people thought Pop didn't like threes. They're top 10 in 3-pointers attempted in percentage. And
well, maybe that's Pop trying to tank. He's like, hey, hold on, let's take wait, crap, this works.
I had them projected 29th in 3-point percentage coming into the season, behind the Lakers even. That's how low I had them projected. So I don't know if they're going to keep shooting it quite that well from 3-point range, but it's been a winning formula so far.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about the best players so far on both of those teams. And you mentioned Keldon Johnson, who they signed to an extension, what was it, 4 years, 74, somewhere in that range. The early returns on that looks like a heck of a deal for the Spurs. And this is a dude who, looking at his numbers now, he's averaging about 24, 5, and 4 so far this season. Shooting the three, 43.5%, from the floor.
Taking a bunch of them.
Yeah, taking a bunch of them. So he's averaging an efficient 24, 5.5 rebounds, 4 assists, only 23 years old. What's the ceiling for a Keldon Johnson? Can Keldon Johnson be a franchise cornerstone type of player?
I think probably not, but if you do get the lottery pick that we expect him to get at some point here, can he be the number 2 guy behind that player? I think that's pretty reasonable. A couple of years ago, I somewhat infamously had him in my top 25 players under 25 and did not have a certain New York Knicks swingman who was drafted much higher in that group and who got a somewhat larger extension. But,
yes.
You also look at,
that was the most polite told you so that you will ever see on this show.
well, certainly it's the most polite almost anything you're going to see on this show, but I'm not going to take a victory lap on that take just yet. There's still a long ways to go in the development for both those players. But like, you look at the extensions that Barrett, Tyler Hero, Jordan Poole signed. Keldon Johnson's probably been the best player of that group thus far. Jordan Poole's played quite well. Hero's played well as a starter, but what Keldon Johnson is doing, he's the type of guy in terms of that swingman, combo forward who can hit threes and then you add the shot creation on top of it that every team is looking for. Like, that's a really valuable piece. And they got him signed very early before the market kind of got set. And I think before everyone quite had processed the ramifications of the coming cap spike.
Yeah. And then Lauri Markkanen, obviously this is a guy who he's been around a while. This is his 6th year. Came in as a number 7 overall pick, and especially early in his rookie year, there was a lot of hype about him. Hey, woo boy, another sweet shooting 7-foot Euro, with some bounce, with some athleticism. Clearly, I would say his Chicago tenure ended up being disappointing. Simply the fact that they didn't keep him tells you that. Chicago was sort of a strange fit where I think they signed him to be a trade piece, and obviously that worked out well for them, but had a decent season in Cleveland last year. Markkanen, though, 8 games in, and Malik Beasley's already hyping him as an all-star. Markkanen, to his credit, pointed out 8 games a little bit early for that. Shooting better than 50% from the floor. Actually not shooting well from 3-point range, but scoring from everywhere else. 23 a game, 9 rebounds, 3 assists. On the heels of a spectacular summer playing for Finland in Eurobasket. Markkanen is still a young guy. Looking at the age, he's only 25 years old. What are we looking at for upside here?
The fascinating part of it is what you kind of glossed over. Like, he's doing all this. He's top 10 he's number 10 in my wins above replacement player metric. As I tweeted out last week with the one of these players is not like the others, and people had some fun with. And yet he's not shooting the three well. You
Right.
associate that with, oh, this guy just had a hot streak from three, like Bojan Bogdanovic's start, where he was making over 50% of his threes in Detroit.
Mhm.
He's managing to play this well without that. Well, he's probably underachieving a little bit from three.
Oh, for
And,
sure. He's shooting the three right now, 31.5%. I mean, he's a 36% career shooter. You know, he shot 40% his last year in Chicago. So yeah, a guy who I think when people think of marketing, the first thing they think is he's a 7-foot shooter. He's not shooting it well from three, but he is, I mean, he is scoring everywhere. He's scoring off the dribble, he's scoring the little post ups. Uh, I mean, he's been spectacular for the Jazz.
yeah, and I really like this Will Hardy offense. Like that, if you're talking about their obstacles to getting a high lottery pick this year, number one, they got too much proven talent. And number two, Will Hardy looks like he can coach in his first year here,
Mm-hmm.
replacing Quinn Snyder. And one of the things they've done with this funky starting lineup where Markkanen's again at the three, like he was in Cleveland. You got Kelly Olynyk and Jared Vanderbilt. And Vanderbilt is effectively the five on offense since he's the guy who's going to be around the basket. But you switch anything involving either Markkanen or Olynyk, which, most teams it's going to be an automatic switch if the small forward is involved in a screening action with a perimeter player. You do that against Utah, all of a sudden Markkanen's got this huge height advantage. Or if it's Olynyk is being defended by the three, same thing. And that's something they've taken a lot of advantage of. And as much as it seemed like a joke, Cleveland playing Markkanen at the three last year, and Utah's got that same issue where they don't really have
Right.
anyone between. They've got all these guys between 6'1" and 6'5", and then they've got all these guys who are 6'8" and up, and no one basically in between other than Simone Fontecchio hasn't played a whole lot.
No,
But Markkanen
you
seems,
just wanted to prove you could pronounce that.
look, as someone of Italian descent, I got to throw in a Simone Fontecchio reference every now and again. Uh, it seemed like a joke, but like Markkanen suddenly seems kind of comfortable defending at small forward. His length is a problem in the passing lanes at times.
So you heard from KP, Lauri Markkanen, MVP candidate.
Yes. If there's one takeaway from Howdy Partners, that should be it.
And we understand the MVP is probably the second most prestigious award in the NBA. You know the most prestigious award, the Cojones Factor Player of the Week. And we are awarding the Cojones Factor Player of the Week every week right here on Howdy Partners. And KP, as I'm watching that Mavs meltdown, I turned to the gentleman next to me at one point and I said, who the front door is number 11 on the Thunder? I scan. And then I said, what the front door is Isaiah Joe doing in this game? And then he just kept hitting jumper after jumper after jumper, big shot after big shot after big shot. Isaiah Joe, the Jonas Player of the Week. KP, this dude was DNPCD. He is a scrap heap pickup after the Sixers waived him at the end of the preseason. Here's his line in that game: 15 points, 4 of 4 from the floor, 3 of 3 from three, made all 4 free throws, plus 24 in 9 minutes and 4 seconds. The last 9 minutes and 4 seconds for that performance, off of the fact that I didn't know who the hell he was and had to literally look him up when I looked out there and saw him on the floor. Isaiah Joe, this is definitely going to be the most prestigious honor of his NBA career. He is the Cojones Factor Player of the Week.
Yeah, I watched that overtime. I didn't really watch the end of regulation. And then Isaiah Joe, it's just like open three, bang, splash over and over again. He's someone who I had pretty high in my projections coming out of college when Philly took him in the second round, which is unsurprising because often they tend to take a lot of players who the Morey teams tend to take a lot of players who score highly in my projections. And he never really got much of an opportunity in Philly and kind of developed in summer league and in the G League into more of a volume scorer than he was, a microwave scorer than he was the pure catch and shoot guy that I kind of envisioned. But that for one night, at least in Oklahoma City, after he was waived by the Sixers and picked up by the Thunder on a long-term minimum deal, another Hinkie special, he justified it entirely with that performance.
By the way, if we're going to get into premature all-star hype, probably want to take a good look there at Shai Gilgeous-Alexander as long as he's able to steer clear of plantar fasciitis or other tank-related potential ailments. Just saying. pretty good player. KP, you survived. I think it was a pretty friendly version of Howdy Partners. I believe I only referred to you as a nerd once or twice. I told you to be a minimum of a dozen. But I appreciate you coming on, man.
Yeah, if you took the under on that, you won. Thanks for having me.
That will do it for episode 4 of Howdy Partners. Adios, amigos.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.